Welcome to the Introduction for Cultural Anthropology, Chapters 1 and 2 in your textbook. This week we're going to talk a little bit about anthropology. So first, what is anthropology? It's the study of humans and their culture. It differs from other fields that study human beings because it's holistic, meaning it studies the whole of human condition, both biological and cultural variation in space and time, and it is comparative and global. Anthropology looks to explain human nature, illuminating human similarities and differences, and describes contemporary societies and cultures, and looks to build empathy for human groups who seek integrity and security. It looks at variables like age, gender, religion, sexuality, race, ethnicity, class, ability, etc. Basically all the things as you look at your syllabus that we're going to be talking about during this semester. Anthropology has four main subfields: sociocultural, otherwise just known as cultural, archaeological, biological, and linguistic. As a discipline, anthropology attempts to explain and interpret differences and similarities between and amongst cultures and societies. The methodology of cultural anthropology is called ethnography. Ethnography involves first-hand, field-based study of a particular culture, typically during a year or more in the field. So we're going to be doing a small version of an ethnography for your final project in this course. Obviously, it won't be over a year, but you'll be doing things like interviewing, observations, and research. Anthropology is both a science and a humanities field. It's a science because it's based on cumulative knowledge, the science of human similarities and differences. It's a humanities because it includes things like art, narratives, music, dance, and other forms of creative expression. When you think about this concept of a mirror for humanity, consider a time where you were in a situation where you were in unfamiliar territory. Perhaps you were in a study abroad program, or maybe you went on a mission trip to a southern state. Or another example might be hanging around a group of people who speak differently than you do, whether it's an entirely different language altogether, or maybe it's a different kind of English, or a group of people whose profession has a very unique language all their own, maybe like engineers. Consider the things you went through during that time. Did you feel uncomfortable? If so, why? How did you deal with that discomfort? What did you learn by being the outsider? Many find that being the odd man out teaches them a lot about appreciating others who are regularly on the outside. It helps them reflect on the values of the group they currently belong to and provides them with a chance to see how others might view them. In addition to looking at things from the anthropology perspective, we're also going to be looking at American culture studies. That's primarily my background. So what is American culture studies? Well, it began as a study of culture through history and literature, but has expanded to include pop culture, gender, race and ethnicity, class, psychology, and sociology. We define the field as interdisciplinary, which means that it will use the methodology and theories of multiple disciplines. So you can see how this is a good fit with anthropology. So what is culture? A culture is made up of a group of people who share attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, practices, products, experiences, and/or conditions of existence. It's best described as social environment and process. Cultures are living entities that are always changing, growing, in process through the development of technologies, through intercultural, meaning between culture, exchanges, through things like migration, etc. What a culture values and how it operates changes over time. For example, think about how technologies like the telephone or internet have changed American culture. And now we're able to interact with people all over the world at any given time. We can take classes in our pajamas and have countless options of things to purchase at our fingertips. Our perceptions of things like online dating have changed over time too. It used to be frowned upon. Now 1 in 5 singles have tried online dating. When we talk about culture, anthropologists are talking about culture with a big C, which they describe as a human's ability to create and transmit traditions, customs, beliefs, and symbols that dictate how we behave and interact with each other. Underneath this big C culture, there are many small c cultures, probably what we all think about when we think of different cultures, different people who share geography, history, economics, etc. As humans, we like to rank things, including cultures. It's important to note that anthropologists see all cultures as equally valuable. Cultures that are ranked a bit higher often receive greater rewards and privileges, which we'll talk about more later. Many people believe that their culture is quote-unquote natural, that they didn't have to learn how to be a member because it's always been there. That's a common misconception. Culture is a way of living that we learn as children from important people in our lives, our families, teachers, community leaders, and previous generations. Our traditions and customs mold who we are and what we believe. The process of learning how to be a member of a culture is called enculturation. Enculturation helps us to answer questions like, what's the right way of doing something? What do we consider dangerous? What do we consider immoral? We might learn these things directly from parents or teachers as children and adults, but many of these things are learned over time through observations of what's considered normal. The amount of physical space we keep between ourselves is a good example of this. No one ever tells us as Americans that we should keep a space bubble between us, but for anyone who's ever been to Europe, they quickly learn that many Europeans don't share the same value of our space bubble. When I was in college and in grad school, I had the opportunity to travel abroad quite a bit. This is a picture from one of my favorite places in Poland. When I first started traveling overseas, I struggled a little bit with culture shock, which the authors describe as a disturbed feeling that people encounter when they deal with a new culture. Here I was in a strange place. The people didn't speak the way I did. I didn't know where I should go to buy things like food. The streets were numbered in a way I found confusing, and the people seemed rude. When facing a new culture, it's easy to fall into the ethnocentrism trap. That is, believing that one's own culture is better than another culture. Because I didn't understand this new culture, it's easy to discount their way of doing things and wish that they would adapt to my way of doing things. However, through close observation, I was able to better understand and appreciate why the various cultures I encountered did things the way they did, through cultural relativism. I learned a great deal about myself and my own culture through the process, which goes back to this idea of a mirror for humanity. So when we think of culture, there are umbrella cultures and then smaller cultures that fall underneath that umbrella. For example, Latino culture. When we say Latino culture, we name both the people who identify themselves or who are identified with the label of Latino, right? So people who live in South and Central America, people from South and Central American heritage living in the U.S., etc. So many Latinos have shared experiences, products, beliefs, and conditions of existence. But it's important to note that not all Latino persons will share all aspects of Latino culture. And when we think about individual cultures like Cuban, Puerto Rican, Mexican, Spanish, Brazilian, all of these cultures have very rich histories of their own, and they're not the same. So what does it mean to say dominant culture? Who defines the ideas, beliefs, and values that are presumably held by the dominant culture? When we think about this, the term hegemony comes to mind. Hegemony is best defined as one group having power over another in a society that claims to be democratic in nature. So technically, in the United States, we claim that all people are equal. However, when we think about it, not all people have access to the same privileges and rights that everyone else does. For instance, we might think of people who don't have heterosexual privilege, right? They don't have the same rights and privileges to marry as others. This means there's a set of standards and rules which are often unwritten that are imposed for correct behavior or normalcy. These rules are imposed by the dominant culture through cultural institutions. So what are these cultural institutions? They are financial and corporate, government, politics and law, health and medicine, media, entertainment and the arts, peers and community, military, social services and prisons, education, religion, and family. These cultural institutions frequently work towards the maintenance of the status quo. In other words, they tend to resist change. Because of the power structure of our culture, what we perceive as normal is set by the dominant culture. Most other cultural groups are often labeled as subcultures. Most scholars agree that to label a cultural group identified by an affiliation with a nationality or racial identity as a subculture is an insult. For example, African Americans are not a subculture of American culture. However, we might say that hip-hop or blues is a subculture within African American culture. So let's talk a little bit about what cultural theorists do. First, they examine the relationship between text and context. Text is defined as any piece of cultural evidence, whether it's a book, television show, image, artifact, etc., and context being the circumstances, events, or elements that surround, support, or define a term, culture, identity, etc. So an example of this might be looking at a specific television show within the context of the time it was produced. When we think about a show like Dallas or Ally McBeal or Ellen, it's important to consider the things that were happening in the culture during the time when it was produced, whether it's protecting American values, women in the workplace, or issues of sexuality. Some of these things might not be particularly shocking today, but they were at the time when they produced. When we read a text, whether it's a book, TV show, or artifact, it's important to consider the situation in which it was created and how it's reflective of the values of that time period. So what else do they do? They think about history as a constructive narrative. What does that mean? Well, one individual's historical account does not make for the capital T truth. History is made up of several different accounts of the same event, and a specific history is only a partial account of what's been written according to the conventions of its time. Truth varies based on one's viewpoint in a culture and how one relates to the dominant culture. So let's use this picture as an example. Say I'm relaying to you a story about an accident that happened on the highway. When I'm telling a police officer what happened from my point of view as the person who was hit, it most likely will be different from the person who hit me. Someone else who's driving on the opposite side of the highway might have a totally different perspective. None of these stories are totally right, but neither are they totally wrong. When we create a history, it's important to note that different people in the story have different things at stake. The same is true with historical accounts. If we look at the colonization of America from only the white settlers' perspective, we're missing a crucial piece that helps us to understand the entirety of what happened. And finally, cultural theorists examine the relationship between cultural myth and reality. What's a cultural myth? It's the development of a story, a way of thinking or being, or looking at the world in order to help a culture understand themselves or their experiences. Cultural myths tend to banish complexities, oversimplify, or gloss over some of the more difficult aspects of our lives or our pasts. They help us to understand our place in the world, defining our relationship with each other, to the past and future, to nature, to power, and to the nation. In order to examine myths, it's important to think critically. What does it mean to think critically? How does understanding our cultural myths help us to locate and begin to understand the cultural tensions in American society? All of these things are things that we're going to think about during this week and again during the rest of the class. Now that we've reviewed some of the basics about anthropology, what cultural theorists do, and know a little bit about what culture is, it's time to read about this a little further in your textbook. As a reminder, your quiz will cover both these lecture notes as well as what's in the book.